In the heart of a bustling Midwest city, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and narrow alleys whispered secrets, two FBI agents were preparing for one of the most critical missions of their careers. Marcus Hayes, a seasoned African-American, agent with over a decade of experience in undercover operations, was known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. His partner, Rachel Cohen, a white woman with piercing blue eyes and an unmatched talent for piecing together clues, complemented Marcus perfectly. Together they had solved some of the toughest cases in the Bureau's history. But this time, their mission was unlike anything they'd faced before. The target was a shadowy organized crime syndicate that had been terrorizing the region for years. This wasn't just any criminal group. It was a well-oiled machine involved in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and illegal arms deals. The syndicate operated like ghosts, slipping through cracks that law enforcement couldn't reach. For months, Marcus and Rachel had worked tirelessly to gain the trust of its members. They posed as small-time criminals eager to climb the ranks, attending underground meetings, making connections, and proving their loyalty bit by bit. It was dangerous work, but they knew the stakes. If they succeeded, they could dismantle the entire operation and save countless lives. Their efforts finally paid off when they received an invitation to a secret meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. Intelligence suggested that key evidence would be exchanged during the meeting, evidence that could bring down the syndicate once and for all. Marcus and Rachel spent days planning every detail of their approach. They memorized escape routes, rehearsed their cover stories, and double-checked their disguises. Everything had to be perfect. One wrong move, one slip-up, and not only would the mission fail, but their lives would also be in grave danger. As the day of the meeting approached, excitement mingled with tension. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He trusted Rachel completely, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside. They had trained for this. They were ready. On the evening of the meeting, the air was thick with anticipation. Marcus and Rachel arrived at the warehouse separately to avoid suspicion, parking their cars far enough away to blend in. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. Inside, dim lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The hum of conversation grew louder as they stepped inside, careful to maintain their cover. Syndicate members milled about, exchanging hushed words and suspicious glances. Marcus nodded curtly at a few familiar faces, keeping his expression neutral. Rachel stayed close, her hand brushing against the concealed recording device hidden beneath her jacket. For a while, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The exchange was about to begin, and Marcus could feel adrenaline coursing through his veins. Then, without warning, chaos erupted. Bright headlights pierced the darkness outside, followed by the deafening wail of sirens. Before anyone could react, local police officers stormed into the warehouse, weapons drawn. Shouts filled the air as people scrambled to flee. Marcus instinctively reached for his badge, shouting, "FBI, stand down!" But his voice was drowned out by the commotion. What happened next felt like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Officer Greg Miller, a burly man with a reputation for aggressive behavior, zeroed in on Marcus immediately. Ignoring his protests and credentials, Miller grabbed Marcus roughly by the arm and slapped handcuffs around his wrists. "You've got some nerve pretending to be one of us," Miller sneered, his tone laced with contempt. Marcus tried to explain, but Miller cut him off, shoving him toward a patrol car. Rachel fared no better. She too was detained, though Miller treated her with less hostility. The scene was chaotic, humiliating, and utterly devastating. As the dust settled, Marcus and Rachel watched helplessly as the syndicate members vanished into the night, taking the crucial evidence with them. Their mission, months of painstaking effort, had been destroyed in a matter of minutes. And as the reality of what had just happened sank in, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, was this really about stopping a crime? Or had something far more sinister driven these officers to act so recklessly? The betrayal stung deeply, not just because of the failed mission, but because of the blatant disregard for justice and humanity that had fueled it. Little did Marcus and Rachel know, this was only the beginning of a long and painful journey that would test their resolve, challenge their beliefs, and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about the world they thought they understood. The night of the botched raid replayed itself in Marcus Hayes' mind like a broken record. Every detail, the flashing lights, the shouts, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, was etched into his memory with painful clarity. He sat slumped on a hard bench inside the local police station, still wearing the same clothes he'd been arrested in. Rachel Cohen sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly together. Neither of them had spoken much since their arrest. The weight of what had happened hung heavy between them, suffocating any attempt at conversation. Officer Greg Miller stood nearby, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across his face. To him, this was just another routine bust gone wrong. But to Marcus and Rachel, it was a nightmare that refused to end. They had identified themselves as FBI agents multiple times during the chaos, but Miller either didn't believe them or didn't care. Instead, he focused all his attention on Marcus, treating him with a level of disdain that bordered on cruelty. "You think you can waltz in here, pretend to be one of us?" Miller barked, leaning close enough for Marcus to see the flecks of anger in his eyes. "I've seen your type before, always trying to play the hero." Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He knew that. But every word out of Miller's mouth felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the insults. It was the tone, the way Miller seemed to take pleasure in making him feel small. For years, Marcus had faced discrimination in various forms, from subtle microaggressions to outright hostility. He thought he had developed thick skin over time, but this was different. This wasn't just racism, it was abuse of power, plain and simple. And knowing that Miller's actions had jeopardized an entire federal investigation made it even harder to swallow. Rachel, though visibly shaken, tried to intervene. "Sir, you need to listen to us," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We're not lying about who we are. Call the Bureau, verify our credentials. You're making a huge mistake." Her words only seemed to irritate Miller further. He turned his glare on her, his lip curling into a sneer. "Oh, I'm sure you'd say anything to get out of this mess," he shot back. "But don't worry, sweetheart. We'll figure out exactly what kind of game you two are playing." The dismissive way he addressed Rachel infuriated Marcus. She was a highly respected agent, someone whose dedication to justice rivaled his own. Yet in Miller's eyes, she was nothing more than a pawn in whatever twisted narrative he had concocted. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but Rachel placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently urging him to stay quiet. She knew how volatile situations like this could become if emotions ran too high. Hours dragged by as they waited for someone, anyone, to step in and sort things out. Eventually, a senior officer arrived, looking flustered and annoyed. He listened, half-heartedly, as Marcus and Rachel explained their situation, then reluctantly called the FBI headquarters to confirm their identities. When the call came back verifying that they were indeed federal agents, the mood in the room shifted dramatically. The senior officer's face turned red with embarrassment, and he began issuing hurried apologies while ordering Miller to release them immediately. But the damage had already been done. By the time Marcus and Rachel walked out of the station, the syndicate members they had spent months infiltrating were long gone. The secret meeting at the warehouse had been their best chance to gather concrete evidence against the organization, and now it was lost forever. As they climbed into their car, Marcus rested his forehead against the steering wheel, letting out a deep sigh. "All that work? Wasted," he muttered under his breath. Rachel placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but there was no comfort to be found in this moment. Back at the office, the fallout from the failed mission was swift and brutal. Their supervisor, Agent Linda Carter, called them into her office first thing the next morning. A no-nonsense woman with sharp features and sharper intellect, Carter wasted no time getting to the point. "What happened last night was unacceptable," she said, pacing behind her desk. "Not only did we lose valuable intel, but the syndicate now knows we're onto them. Do you have any idea how much danger this puts us in?" How much danger it puts innocent people in. Marcus nodded grimly. He understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone, but what frustrated him most was the lack of accountability on the part of the local police. "Ma'am, Officer Miller deliberately ignored our credentials," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "He singled me out because of my race. You saw how he treated me compared to Rachel. If he hadn't acted so recklessly, none of this would have happened." Carter sighed, rubbing her temples as if trying to ward off an impending headache. "I know, Marcus. Believe me, I do. But going after the police department isn't going to undo what's been done. Right now, our priority has to be damage control. We need to regroup, reassess, and find another way to take down this syndicate." Though Carter's words made sense, they offered little solace to Marcus. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here, something beyond just one bad cop. Over the next few days, he replayed the events of that night, over and over in his head, searching for answers. Why had Miller targeted him so aggressively? Was it purely personal bias, or was there a larger pattern of behavior within the department? The questions gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night. Meanwhile, Rachel struggled with her own feelings of guilt and frustration. As much as she wanted to support Marcus, she couldn't ignore the fact that she had been treated differently during the raid. While Miller had been hostile toward both of them, his treatment of Marcus was undeniably harsher. It was a stark reminder of the privilege she enjoyed simply because of the color of her skin. For the first time in her career, she found herself questioning whether she truly understood the challenges her partner faced on a daily basis. As the days turned into weeks, the rift between Marcus and Rachel grew wider. They continued working together, but the easy camaraderie they once shared had vanished. Conversations became strained, filled with unspoken tensions and lingering doubts. Marcus buried himself in paperwork, avoiding eye contact whenever possible. Rachel, desperate to bridge the gap, tried initiating conversations, but her efforts fell flat. It was clear that the incident had left scars neither of them knew how to heal. Outside the walls of the FBI, the story began to spread. Word of the botched raid reached the media, sparking outrage among the public. Headlines screamed about racial profiling and police misconduct, putting pressure on the local department to address the growing controversy. Officer Miller, however, remained unapologetic. In interviews, he defended his actions, claiming he had followed proper procedure and accusing Marcus of attempting to exploit his position for personal gain. His statements only fueled the fire, drawing criticism from civil rights groups and community leaders alike. For Marcus, the media frenzy was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought much-needed attention to the issue of systemic racism within law enforcement. On the other hand, it reopened old wounds, forcing him to relive the humiliation of that night over and over again. Friends and colleagues reached out to offer support, but Marcus found it difficult to trust anyone. The betrayal he had experienced cut deeper than he cared to admit. And yet amidst the chaos, a spark of determination began to ignite within him. If Officer Miller thought he could silence him, or worse, destroy his career, then he was sorely mistaken. Marcus vowed to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Little did he know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless others as well. The days following the botched raid were a blur of frustration, anger, and soul-searching for Marcus Hayes. Every morning he woke up with the same sinking feeling in his chest, as if the weight of what had happened was pressing down on him harder, each day. The mission that had consumed months of his life, a mission he had poured his heart and soul into, was now nothing more than a bitter memory. Worse still, the syndicate they had been chasing wasn't just back in business. It was operating with renewed confidence, knowing law enforcement was onto them but unable to act effectively. The failure gnawed at Marcus, not because he cared about his reputation, but because innocent lives were at stake. Rachel Cohen tried her best to stay by his side during this difficult time, but their partnership had changed. There was an invisible wall between them now, one neither seemed able to breach. Rachel wanted desperately to help Marcus, to show him she understood how deeply the incident had affected him, but she also felt powerless. She couldn't undo what had happened, nor could she fully grasp the depth of the pain Marcus carried. It wasn't just about the raid or Officer Miller's actions. It was about years of systemic racism Marcus had endured silently, only for it all to explode in his face that night. Still, Rachel refused to give up. If anything, the distance between them made her even more determined to stand by his side no matter what. Marcus knew he couldn't let things slide. He couldn't just move on and pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. After much deliberation, he decided to file a formal complaint against Officer Greg Miller and the local police department. Filing the complaint wasn't an easy decision. It would bring scrutiny not only to the officers involved but also to himself and Rachel. People would question his motives, accuse him of playing the victim, or worse, try to discredit him entirely. But Marcus believed silence would only perpetuate the problem. If he didn't speak up, who would? When the complaint landed on the desk of the Internal Affairs Division, it sent shockwaves through the police department. Officer Miller, who had spent weeks defending himself publicly and privately, was blindsided. He had assumed the whole ordeal would blow over quickly, especially since many of his colleagues had already rallied around him. Instead, the FBI agent he had dismissed so callously was fighting back, and doing so loudly. Miller's initial reaction was denial. "This is ridiculous," he told anyone who would listen. "I was doing my job. That guy isn't even real police." His words carried little weight outside the tight-knit circle of officers who shared his views, but within the department they struck a chord. As news of the complaint spread, tensions began to rise. Some officers stood firmly behind Miller, dismissing Marcus's claims as exaggerated or fabricated. Others, however, started to question whether there might be truth to his accusations. Whispers circulated about Miller's history of discriminatory behavior, how he often targeted minority citizens during traffic stops, how he used racial slurs in private conversations, how he consistently avoided accountability whenever complaints arose. These stories had always been brushed aside before, chalked up to tough policing or just joking around. But now, under the glaring spotlight of public attention, they took on new significance. For Miller, the mounting pressure was unbearable. He had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable, that his badge gave him immunity from consequences. Now, for the first time, he found himself on shaky ground. His superiors called him into meetings, demanding explanations and assurances that he hadn't acted out of prejudice. Reporters hounded him for interviews, forcing him to defend himself, repeatedly. Even his own family began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the negative attention swirling around him. The once confident officer grew increasingly agitated, lashing out at anyone who dared challenge him. Meanwhile, Marcus faced challenges of his own. Within the FBI, opinions were divided. Some agents admired his courage, praising him for taking a stand against injustice. Others, however, questioned whether filing the complaint was worth the risk. "You're opening yourself up to a lot of scrutiny here," one colleague warned him. "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Marcus appreciated the concern, but he didn't waver. "If I don't do something now," he replied, "then when will anything ever change?" Public opinion became another battleground. Once word of the complaint reached the media, the story exploded. News outlets ran headlines questioning whether racial bias had played a role in the failed raid. Social media platforms lit up with debates, some supporting Marcus and others defending Miller. Civil rights organizations seized the opportunity to highlight broader issues of systemic racism within law enforcement, organizing protests and calling for reforms. Community leaders demanded answers, urging government officials to investigate not just Miller but the entire police department. Amidst the chaos, Rachel emerged as a vocal advocate for Marcus. Though she initially hesitated to step into the spotlight, fearing it might overshadow his voice, she soon realized her support was crucial. In interviews, she recounted the events of the raid in detail, emphasizing how Miller's actions had directly led to the mission's failure. Her testimony added credibility to Marcus's claims and helped sway public opinion in their favor. For Marcus, having Rachel by his side meant more than she could ever know. It reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight, that someone truly understood the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. As the investigation into Miller's conduct progressed, cracks began to form in the foundation of the police department. Internal documents revealed patterns of misconduct stretching back years, implicating not only Miller but several of his superiors as well. Emails surfaced showing attempts to cover up previous incidents involving racial profiling. Training records highlighted gaps in diversity education programs. What had started as an isolated case of bad behavior was slowly exposing a web of institutional failures. Miller, emboldened by the unwavering support of his colleagues, initially dug in his heels. He doubled down on his defense, insisting he had done nothing wrong. But as evidence mounted against him, his confidence began to falter. Late-night phone calls to friends turned into desperate pleas for advice. His temper flared more frequently, leading to reckless decisions that only worsened his situation. During routine patrols, he became increasingly aggressive, targeting minority citizens without cause and leaving a trail of complaints that eventually reached the state attorney general's office. For Marcus, watching Miller unravel was both satisfying and sobering. On one hand, it felt like justice was finally taking shape. On the other hand, it served as a painful reminder of how far-reaching the effects of racism could be, not just for its victims, but for its perpetrators as the investigation dragged on, Marcus found himself reflecting on his own journey. He thought about the countless times he had swallowed his pride, ignored insults, and pushed forward despite the odds stacked against him. This moment, he realized, wasn't just about holding Miller accountable. It was about reclaiming his dignity, proving to himself and the world that he deserved to be treated with respect. And yet, as empowering as that realization was, it came with a heavy burden. Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Fighting for justice rarely was. But as he sat in his apartment late one evening, staring out the window at the city skyline, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this fight could lead to real change. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. With Rachel by his side and the weight of public support behind him, Marcus resolved to see this through, no matter what it took. As the investigation into Officer Greg Miller and the local police department intensified, the pressure on everyone involved reached a boiling point. For Marcus Hayes, the weeks that followed felt like navigating a minefield. Every step forward brought new challenges, but also glimpses of hope. The independent inquiry, led by state-appointed investigators, was thorough and unrelenting. They combed through years of records, interviewed witnesses, and scrutinized every decision made by the department. What they uncovered painted a damning picture, not just of Miller, but of an entire system that had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. The first major breakthrough came when investigators reviewed body camera footage from the night of the raid. The video, grainy but clear enough to make out key details, showed Miller's blatant disregard for protocol. From the moment he entered the warehouse, his actions were aggressive and dismissive. When Marcus repeatedly identified himself as an FBI agent, Miller ignored him entirely, instead focusing on humiliating and intimidating him. The footage also revealed how differently Rachel Cohen was treated during the same incident. While she too was detained, Miller's tone and demeanor toward her were markedly less hostile, a stark contrast that spoke volumes about his biases. When the video was released to the public, it sparked outrage. Social media erupted with calls for accountability, and protests sprang up across the city. Community leaders, civil rights activists, and even some law enforcement officials joined the chorus, demanding justice. The tide was turning, and for the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of vindication. People were listening. His voice, once drowned out by Miller's arrogance, was now being amplified by thousands who refused to let this injustice go unnoticed. But while the momentum was building outside, tensions within the police department continued to escalate. Miller, cornered and increasingly desperate, began lashing out at anyone he perceived as a threat. He accused his superiors of throwing him under the bus, claiming they were using him as a scapegoat to save face. His colleagues, many of whom had initially supported him, started distancing themselves as evidence mounted against him. Some even cooperated with investigators, providing testimony that further implicated Miller in a pattern of discriminatory behavior. One officer recounted how Miller had bragged about targeting minority drivers during traffic stops, boasting about the number of tickets he issued compared to his peers. Another described overhearing Miller use racial slurs during casual conversations, dismissing them as harmless jokes when challenged. For Miller, the unraveling of his career was swift and brutal. Once celebrated as a tough, no-nonsense cop, he was now vilified as a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. The Internal Affairs Division recommended his immediate suspension pending further review, and the mayor publicly condemned his actions, calling them unacceptable and a betrayal of trust. Yet despite the mounting evidence, Miller refused to admit fault. In interviews and press conferences, he doubled down on his narrative, painting himself as a victim of political correctness run amok. "I'm not racist," he declared in one particularly heated exchange with reporters. "I was doing my job. If people can't handle that, then maybe they shouldn't be in this line of work." His defiance only fueled the firestorm surrounding him. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits against the department, alleging systemic discrimination and negligence. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters daily, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus Hayes," and "End Police, Racism Now." Even members of Miller's own family began speaking out, expressing disappointment and shame over his behavior. His wife moved out, taking their children with her, citing concerns about the toxic environment he had created at home. Friends stopped answering his calls, leaving him isolated and bitter. Amidst the chaos, Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight in ways he hadn't anticipated. Reporters hounded him for interviews, eager to hear his perspective on the growing scandal. At first, he hesitated to engage, fearing it might distract from the larger issues at hand. But Rachel encouraged him to share his story, reminding him that his voice could inspire others to speak up. Reluctantly, Marcus agreed, giving a series of televised interviews where he spoke candidly about his experiences with racism, both inside and outside law enforcement. His words resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom reached out to thank him for shedding light on a problem they had long struggled to articulate. Rachel, meanwhile, continued to stand firmly by Marcus's side. She testified before investigative panels recounting the events of the raid in vivid detail. Her calm, composed demeanor lent credibility to her account, countering attempts by Miller's supporters to discredit her. She also worked tirelessly behind the scenes, helping Marcus navigate the emotional toll of the ordeal. Late nights were spent strategizing with legal advisors, drafting statements, and preparing for hearings. Though the strain was evident, dark, circles under her eyes, moments of quiet frustration, it never dampened her resolve. "We're in this together," she told Marcus more than once. "No matter what happens, we'll get through it." The climax of the investigation came when the state attorney general announced formal charges against Miller. He was arrested on multiple counts of misconduct, including racial profiling, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, serving as a powerful reminder that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. As Miller was led away in handcuffs, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, Marcus watched silently from afar. It wasn't triumph he felt in that moment, but relief. Relief that someone finally was being held accountable. With Miller out of commission, attention turned to the broader issue of systemic racism within the police department. Investigators unveiled sweeping recommendations for reform, ranging from mandatory diversity training programs to stricter oversight measures. The mayor pledged full support for implementing these changes, promising to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Community forums were organized, giving citizens a platform to voice their concerns and suggest solutions. Slowly but surely, the conversation shifted from blame to progress. For Marcus, the shift was bittersweet. On one hand, he was heartened by the steps being taken to address the root causes of the problem. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the personal cost of the fight. Trust, once broken, was difficult to repair. Though relations with Rachel had improved significantly since the early days of the fallout, there were still moments of tension. Their partnership had weathered the storm, but it would take time to fully heal. Similarly, Marcus's faith in the justice system remained cautious. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. As the dust began to settle, Marcus received an invitation to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. Standing before a packed auditorium, he reflected on everything he had endured, from the humiliation of the raid to the exhausting battle for accountability. His voice steady and unwavering, he delivered a message that resonated far beyond the walls of the venue. Justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you fight for. And if we want real change, we have to start by holding ourselves and each other accountable. The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the work that still needed to be done. The road to true equality was long and fraught with obstacles, but he was ready to keep walking it, one step at a time. The months that followed were transformative, not just for Marcus Hayes and Rachel Cohen, but for the entire city. The arrest of Officer Greg Miller marked a turning point, one that rippled far beyond the walls of the police department. For years, stories of racial profiling and police misconduct had been dismissed or ignored, swept under the rug by those in power. But now, thanks to Marcus's courage and persistence, the truth was finally coming to light. It wasn't just about holding one bad officer accountable. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed such behavior to thrive in the first place. Miller's trial became a media sensation, drawing national attention. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his discriminatory actions, including body camera footage, witness testimonies, and documented patterns of misconduct stretching back years. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as a scapegoat, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted because of heightened public scrutiny. But their arguments fell flat in the face of irrefutable proof. In the end, the jury didn't hesitate. Miller was found guilty on all counts. The verdict sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide, serving as a stark reminder that accountability was no longer optional. It was mandatory. For Miller, life after conviction was unrecognizable. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison, he quickly became a pariah. Former colleagues who had once defended him now avoided mentioning his name altogether. His family cut ties completely, unable to reconcile with the man they once knew. Inside prison walls, Miller struggled to adapt to his new reality. Once accustomed to wielding authority, he now faced humiliation at every turn. Fellow inmates mocked him relentlessly, calling him officer in sarcastic tones. Guards treated him with cold indifference, refusing to offer even basic courtesies. As days turned into weeks, then months, Miller began to reflect on his choices, though whether out of genuine remorse or self-pity remained unclear. He wrote letters to anyone who might listen, pleading for leniency and claiming he had learned his lesson, but few responded, and fewer still believed him. Outside of prison, the reforms sparked by the scandal started taking shape. The mayor, eager to restore public trust, implemented sweeping changes within the police department. Mandatory diversity training programs were introduced, focusing not just on racial sensitivity, but also on de-escalation techniques and community engagement. Independent oversight boards were established to review complaints against officers, ensuring transparency and fairness. Recruitment efforts prioritized inclusivity, aiming to create a force that better reflected the demographics of the city it served. These measures weren't perfect and progress was slow, but they represented a significant step forward. Community leaders played a crucial role in driving these changes. They organized town halls, inviting residents to voice their concerns directly to city officials. Vigilance committees formed, monitoring police activity and reporting any signs of misconduct. Schools partnered with local organizations to teach students about civic responsibility and the importance of standing up against injustice. Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. People who had once feared speaking out now felt empowered to demand better from their leaders, from law enforcement, and from each other. Marcus Hayes emerged from the ordeal stronger than ever, though not without scars. The experience had tested him in ways he never imagined, forcing him to confront painful truths about himself and society, yet it also reinforced his belief in the power of resilience. With Rachel by his side, he returned to active duty, determined to rebuild what had been lost. Their partnership, though strained during the darkest days of the scandal, grew deeper and more meaningful. Rachel's unwavering support reminded Marcus that true allies existed, even in places you least expected them. Together, they vowed to use their platform to continue advocating for justice, both within the FBI and beyond. One of Marcus's proudest moments came when he was invited to address a group of cadets at the FBI Academy. Standing before rows of young faces filled with ambition and idealism, he spoke candidly about his journey. Being an agent isn't just about solving cases, he told them. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard. It's about recognizing your biases and working to overcome them. And most importantly, it's about remembering why we do this job. To protect people, not harm them. His words resonated deeply with the cadets, many of whom approached him afterward to thank him for sharing his story. Some admitted they had never considered the impact of systemic racism until hearing him speak. Others promised to carry his message forward, vowing to be part of the solution rather than the problem. Watching them, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. If even one of these future agents took his advice to heart, it would make all the struggles worthwhile. Rachel, too, found herself inspired by the changes unfolding around her. She threw herself into mentoring younger agents, particularly women and minorities, helping them navigate the challenges of working in a field still dominated by tradition and bias. Her advocacy extended beyond the Bureau, as she joined forces with community groups to promote dialogue between law enforcement and citizens. Through workshops and panel discussions, she emphasized the importance of empathy and understanding. "We can't expect people to trust us if we don't show them we care," she often said. Her efforts earned widespread praise, cementing her reputation as not just a skilled investigator, but a compassionate leader. As time passed, the memory of the botched raid faded somewhat, replaced by the tangible progress being made. The syndicate Marcus and Rachel had originally set out to dismantle remained elusive, but new leads emerged, thanks to the increased cooperation between federal agencies and local communities. Officers who had once resisted change now embraced it, realizing that accountability benefited everyone, not just the public but themselves as well. Trust, though fragile, began to take root. For Marcus, the journey wasn't over. He knew there would always be battles to fight, injustices to challenge, and hearts to change. But he also knew he wasn't alone. Across the country, others were rising up, refusing to accept the status quo. From grassroots activists to high-ranking officials, a movement was building, one rooted in hope, determination, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of a better future. As he stood in front of another crowd, delivering yet another speech, Marcus couldn't help but smile. The road ahead was long, and obstacles undoubtedly lay in wait. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt optimistic. Justice wasn't something you achieved overnight. It was something you worked toward every single day. And as long as people like him kept pushing, kept fighting, kept believing, real change was possible.